External threats to supply chains have received considerable attention following the well-publicized natural disasters in Japan and Thailand. However, understanding of these risks is at a very early stage. A survey undertaken for the World Economic Forum found that 30% of respondents estimated losses of 5% of annual revenue from supply chain disruption. However, over a quarter of respondents were not able to place any figure on the financial impact at all. It is not that the risks themselves have become more acute. After all, there have always been wars and natural disasters. Rather, it is the evolving supply chain and production strategies of the major global manufacturers which have changed, leading to a rebalancing of the risks inherent within various parts of the supply chain. One distinction which can be made between risks are those of an internal or external nature. Let me give you an example. In the 1980s, the personal computer sector adopted traditional manufacturing practices involving the outlay of huge amounts of capital. The risks were clear, as many of these companies quickly went out of business when their forecasts proved hopelessly wrong. From this period, new business models were developed, which allowed manufacturers to focus on design and marketing and let their suppliers bear the risk of production. This process has been referred to as unbundling of production. In other words, in this example, internal risks were outsourced to contract electronic manufacturers. This, however, did not leave the OEMs risk-free. Rather, the internal risks were transformed into external, that is, those which are inherent in extended supply chains. The risks have changed, but are still there, and they are just as business critical. The unbundling of various production processes has led many OEMs to evolve into what are, in effect, managers of integrated and complex networks of remote but interlinked suppliers. In some cases, this has produced greater levels of risk, and in others, it has had the opposite effect. There is no doubt that extended supply chains are more vulnerable to external threats, but on the other hand, such networks have also dispersed risk by reducing centralization. A small supply chain with a single production facility is highly vulnerable to external events, whereas a large, complex supply chain with multiple supplier options has the potential to be much more robust through a greater number of sourcing options. Each option may have higher supply chain risks attached, although, and this is the key point, the probability of overall network disruption is less than in a small supply chain. When people talk about supply chain risk, they usually mean external threats. These can be divided into four main categories: environmental, including weather, earthquakes, floods and volcanoes; geopolitical, such as the present tensions in the Middle East and even piracy; economic, including supplier failure, for example, during a recession; technological, ranging from power outages to cyber attacks. This chart provides a purely illustrative attempt to assess the damage which an external event can have on a supply chain. For example, an earthquake such as the one in Japan in 2011 has a very major impact on supply chains, but not necessarily at a global level, perhaps more at a local or regional level. A flood can have the same impact, but is only very serious if a large number of suppliers are clustered in the affected area. Shipping rates, in contrast, are a global phenomenon. They affect all supply chains, but although serious, have less of a catastrophic impact. A supplier bankruptcy, on the other hand, may be a local problem, and if contingency plans are in place, may not be that serious. Of course, the seriousness of each of these threats is very specific to each supply chain, as well as the level of disruptiveness of the event in question. The most disruptive supply chain events are those which have not or cannot be planned for. Therefore, it is perhaps more useful, rather than look at past events in order to gain some insight into the future, to identify weaknesses in supply chains instead. Addressing vulnerability is the best way to mitigate the impact of a disruption, although there still remains the issue of how much time and money should be invested on each perceived weakness. The World Economic Forum Supply Chain and Transport Risk Survey 2011 identified the least effectively managed supply chain components. The top 5 are reliance on oil, shared information, fragmentation along the value chain, extensive subcontracting, and supplier visibility. The development of information technologies will play an important role in enhancing the management of these components and hence mitigate supply chain threats. There is little prospect that these risks will diminish, some may even increase. Therefore, the ability to react to events will become the key competitive differentiator, and technologies which enable an enhanced level of supply chain agility will become highly sought after.